They said Lord Eddard Stark died with honor, but they never knew the truth of it. The moment Ned was thrown into the dungeons beneath the Red Keep, a man broken and shamed, he had already made peace with death. But peace was never what he sought. Ned Stark had spent a lifetime playing the game by its rules: honor, truth, and loyalty. But when he came to King's Landing, he realized that honor had no place in a pit of vipers. So he started thinking like one. He never told Catelyn. He didn't tell Robb or even Maester Luwin. Only Varys heard whispers of his plan, and even he never grasped the full weight of it. Ned knew that if he died the way he lived, a man of stubborn pride and noble defiance, it would change nothing. The North would mourn, the South would celebrate, and the game would go on. So he made a choice. He knelt. He confessed to treason, stained his own name, and swallowed every drop of poison they offered him. The very crowd that once cheered his integrity now spat at his disgrace. Joffrey, in a fit of twisted power, demanded his execution. Sansa screamed, Arya wept unseen, and the North watched from afar, powerless. But Ned Stark, he smiled inside. Because that blade, that moment of shock, would be the beginning of the storm. He knew his children would scatter. He knew Robb, hot-blooded and proud, would rise. He knew Catelyn would never forgive. And most importantly, he knew the bannermen of the North, men who had knelt to his father and sworn loyalty to the Stark name, would remember. Winter was coming, and he would be the first flake in the blizzard. The news of his death travelled faster than crows. In Winterfell, Robb clenched his sword until his knuckles bled. He looked to the weirwood tree and whispered, "I'll bring war to them, father. I swear it." Catelyn wept in silence. She hadn't cried since Bran fell, but now the dam broke. "Why would he confess?" she whispered again and again. She asked Maester Luwin. She asked the gods. She even asked Littlefinger, who lied as always. But the only one who understood was old Nan. She sat by the hearth and muttered, "He lied to save you all. That wasn't surrender, child. That was war." Down in King's Landing, Varys stood in the shadows of the throne room, watching the blood stain the wooden platform. He knew things were about to change. Ned Stark wasn't the fool everyone thought. Varys had heard his words in the dark, felt the intent beneath the broken tone. That wasn't despair, it was direction. Ned had never begged for his life. He had bartered it for something greater. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen heard the name Stark for the first time in a dream. In a vision laced with fire, she saw a wolf with its throat slit, but its eyes glowing like embers. And in the north, ravens took flight. Rose Bolton read the message from Winterfell with quiet calculation. "The wolf is dead," it said. "The north must howl." His lips curled slightly. The Stark boy was calling banners. Robb was green, but blood cried for blood. The Karstarks came. The Umbers came. Even the reluctant Mormonts offered blades. Robb rode south with a fury that didn't feel like revenge. It felt like destiny. And all the while, Ned's voice echoed in his mind. "When the snows fall, and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives." What the world didn't know was that Ned had written one final letter, not to his wife, not even to Robb. He sent it to Howland Reed, deep in the neck beneath the mists of the swamps where time forgot its own name. Howland Reed stood on the mossy bank of Greywater Watch. He held a letter written in Ned Stark's firm, unmistakable hand. The parchment was smudged from the damp air, but the message was clear, measured, calculated, and deadly in its intent. Howland read it thrice, each time slower than before. Ned had known. He had known Joffrey would betray the agreement. He had known Sansa's pleas would be wasted on Cersei's icy heart, and he had known that confession would not buy him mercy, but outrage. He had told Howland, "Let them take my head, and I will become more dangerous dead than I ever was alive." The letter didn't ask for revenge. It asked for movement, quiet movement. Secrets whispered to the right ears. Alliances stirred. Ancient debts called in. Ned didn't believe in brute strength alone. He was counting on something else entirely. He was counting on chaos. At River Run, Catelyn arrived with rage burning behind her grief. She had seen war before, but this was different. This was personal. She demanded answers from every lord who swore to her father. "Will you sit idle while the South parades my husband's head?" Some gave excuses, some lowered their eyes, but most remembered Eddard Stark, the boy who fought at the Trident, the man who returned a sister's bones and buried her in silence, the Warden of the North who ruled not with fear, but with quiet respect. And so a wolf army began to rise, but not just with swords. No, Ned's plan was never built on numbers. It was built on breaking foundations. Tyrion Lannister returned to King's Landing as acting hand and walked into a kingdom that had begun to rot. The people cursed Joffrey under their breath. The Riverlands boiled with rebellion. The North howled louder with each passing moon. He asked Varys over a table of wine and ledgers, "Did we gain anything from killing Stark?" Varys only blinked. "We gained fear, but not loyalty, and fear fades fast when it's wet with blood." Littlefinger smiled like a man who thought he had won something. But Varys, deep in the halls beneath the Red Keep, began to suspect the truth, that Ned Stark had played them all. "He knelt like a traitor," Varys whispered to himself, "but died like a spark." Meanwhile, Arya Stark, hidden among the filth of Flea Bottom, sharpened a piece of metal she'd stolen off a butcher's table. It wasn't a real blade. Not yet. But in her mind, she was already carving names. She didn't understand politics or rebellion, but she understood vengeance. And far north of her at the wall, Jon Snow stood beneath a full moon, clutching Ghost's white fur. Maester Aemon had told him of Ned's execution in the gentlest voice he could summon, but Jon didn't cry. He stood still for hours, letting the wind claw at his face. And when he moved, it was only to say, "My watch begins." But inside, the fire had already started to burn. What few knew, what only Howland and perhaps one other soul in Westeros could guess, was that Ned Stark had always kept a secret weapon. Not a sword, not an army, but a truth. And if that truth came to light, it would break kingdoms. He had told Howland, "When my head falls, make sure Jon knows who he is." But Howland Reed was a patient man, and he knew the game wasn't ready yet. So he waited, letting the South fall into disarray, letting the wolves gather, letting the boy king burn through his crown like a torch in dry grass. And far away, Daenerys Targaryen took one more step toward the west. Robb Stark had never intended to be king. He had grown up in the cold halls of Winterfell, thinking only of duty, protecting his family, earning his father's approval, maybe one day guarding the North in his father's place. But now, his father was gone, not lost in battle, not killed in some noble duel, executed like a common criminal in front of a bloodthirsty crowd. And worse, he had confessed. That word ate at Robb like rot. His father, a man of unwavering honor, had admitted to treason. It didn't make sense. The memory of Ned Stark teaching him to hold a sword, to speak the truth even when it hurt, haunted him every night. But then came the letters, from Bannerman, from family, from Howland Reed, delivered by a silent swamp knight wrapped in reeds and shadow. One sentence stood out: "He chose death to light a fire in you." That was the moment Robb stopped mourning and started leading. The northern army swelled as ravens flew. At Moat Cailin, riders passed with urgent banners. The Karstarks came with fury, the Greatjon with drunken pride, and the Manderleys with old, cold vengeance. Each of them had questions about the confession, but none dared speak them aloud. Then the Tullys stood with him. Then came the words no one expected to hear: "King in the North." The chant began at a war table and echoed across winter-blanketed hills. The king in the north, the king in the north. Rob didn't want the crown, but he wore it for his father, for his people, for the war his father's death had triggered. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, chaos festered behind gold walls. Joffrey swaggered through court with a sneer that promised more blood. Sansa, now a hostage cloaked in silk and chains, watched him with eyes too old for her age. She had stopped praying. The gods had done nothing. The queen smiled at her in public, but offered no comfort, only reminders of her father's crimes. But Sansa had begun to change. She remembered her father's words now with bitterness and longing. A ruler who hides behind executioners soon finds himself alone. Joffrey had killed him, and now every decision the boy king made unraveled the realm faster. Cersei tried to hold it together, but whispers of rebellion crawled through the capital. Gold cloaks eyed each other with distrust, breadlines turned violent, and in the shadows Varys moved like smoke through every crack. He knew what Ned Stark had left behind wasn't just a broken family. He had left a storm. Far north, Jon Snow watched as ravens came and went with news of Robb's campaign. Sam read them aloud in quiet tones. The battle's won. The bannerman called. The South in flames. "Your brother's winning," Sam said one night, not looking up from the parchment. Jon didn't answer. He stared into the flames, thinking of the words Maester Aemon had whispered weeks ago. "You're not just Ned's son, are you?" Jon hadn't answered then either, but now he was beginning to feel it. Something stirring, not ambition, not pride. Something heavier, like a truth waiting to be dug out from frozen ground. Howland Reed knew the time was not yet right, but he took the letter Ned had written for Jon and sealed it in ironwood. He buried it beneath the roots of a weirwood, tree that only the Crannogmen worshipped now. The tree would keep it safe. Because one day, when the realm was at its breaking point, when the wolves were not just scattered but circling the heart of the realm, that letter would rise like ice through fire. Ned Stark hadn't just died to stir rebellion. He had died to reshape it. He had known one truth that could melt the crown itself, and he trusted only one boy to carry it. The Riverlands burned. Tywin Lannister's forces moved like a crimson tide across the map, crushing and pillaging, but the North pushed back harder. At the Whispering Wood, Robb Stark proved he wasn't just his father's son. He was something more dangerous, something unexpected. He captured Jaime Lannister in a trap so precise, even the Kingslayer himself admitted, through bloodied lips, "You're your father's ghost, but ghosts don't outmaneuver lions." Robb didn't smile at that. He didn't gloat. His victories were not about pride. They were about justice. Each battle, each loss, each sacrifice was payment for the sight of his father's head rolling off that executioner's block. Back in the Red Keep, the silence between Varys and Tyrion grew louder. With every passing day, the Spider had begun collecting rumors again, of northern victories, of discontent in the Westerlands, of Tywin's growing impatience with Joffrey's impulsiveness. And behind every whisper was the same question. Why did Ned Stark confess? One evening, Varys leaned in close, just as Tyrion finished a goblet of Arbor Gold. "Do you know the most dangerous kind of man, my lord?" Varys asked. Tyrion raised a brow, already suspecting the answer. "The one who dies willingly," Varys said. Tyrion smirked, but the words unsettled him more than he liked. Ned Stark had confessed. Then he had died. But what if that confession had been bait? What if the man had fallen to elevate his house? In Harrenhal, Tywin Lannister sat in the great blackened hall, eating his supper while reports came in. His face never moved, but his knuckles whitened as a messenger detailed the growing rebellion. The North has taken Moat Cailin. The Riverlords are aligning. And Robb Stark has sent word demanding the release of his sisters and the head of the man who ordered his father's death. Tywin dismissed the boy and stared into the fire. His son Jaime was still a prisoner. Cersei was losing grip on the court. Joffrey was a child playing with wildfire. He murmured to himself, Eddard Stark was never a fool. He knew his death would cost us. But the real question, what had it bought him? Sansa, still trapped in the gilded prison of the Red Keep, had learned to smile through clenched teeth. She had learned to speak sweetly, even when rage choked her throat. But deep down, something had cracked open the day she saw her father die. The Sansa who had dreamed of songs and gallant princes was gone. She was learning the game now, and it terrified Cersei more than she knew. "You're quiet these days," the Queen said one night, eyeing Sansa over goblets of wine. "I've nothing left to say," she replied. But in truth, Sansa had everything: memory, hate, and patience. Her father's legacy wasn't just a war in the field. It was a war of silence, masks, and survival. And in Braavos, Arya Stark whispered names to herself as she scrubbed floors and kept her head down. Joffrey, Cersei, the Hound, Ilyn Payne. Ned's execution had carved those names into her bones. She had no war banners, no army, but she carried something colder than steel: purpose. If Robb fought with swords, Arya would fight with silence and poison, with shadow. She still saw her father's last moment in her dreams, not the beheading, but the look he gave her when he spotted her in the crowd. It hadn't been fear, it had been peace, as if he was telling her, "Go now, it's your turn." At Castle Black, Jon Snow stood watch under stars that seemed to burn a little brighter each night. Ghost howled at the moon, restless. News came of Robb's victories, and Jon's chest swelled with pride, but also confusion. He wanted to ride south, he wanted to fight. But his father's last words to him lingered. "You might not have my name, but you have my blood." That truth had always tormented Jon. Now it haunted him, because even in death, Ned Stark had made moves Jon didn't understand yet. And deep inside, Jon could feel the winds changing. Not just for Westeros, for him. He didn't know it yet, but he was the final piece. Winterfell stood quiet. Its great halls, once filled with laughter and the stern discipline of Ned Stark's rule, had grown cold, not just from the creeping frost, but from the emptiness his death left behind. Bran, broken in body but sharpened, in mind, now listened more than he spoke. And what he heard in whispers, in dreams, and from ravens, stirred something ancient in him. He had seen a vision. His father, not at the block, but standing beneath a weirwood tree, speaking to someone. Unseen. Bran didn't understand it yet, but he felt it. Something more had passed that day than a man's life. Something was released. Maester Luwin noticed the boy's change. "You've grown quiet," he said. Bran only nodded. "I think Father knew something. I think he didn't just die. He chose it." And with that, another spark lit among the ashes of House Stark. Robb Stark pushed deeper into the Riverlands. For every victory he claimed, the South whispered louder. The young wolf, the boy king, the northern storm. But Robb wasn't fighting for conquest. He didn't even think he was fighting to win. He was fighting to correct a wrong too great to ignore. Every night he visited Grey Wind under the stars. The direwolf growled and paced restlessly, sensing something bigger in the air. Robb would stroke his fur and whisper, "I won't fail him." In his tent he kept a map of Westeros, and pinned above it the sigil of House Stark with a black ribbon tied beneath it. One night, Catelyn approached him, silent until she stood beside the flickering candle. "He lied, you know," she said softly. Robb turned. "Who?" "Your father. He lied to protect us. That confession, that wasn't surrender. That was a warning." Robb clenched his jaw. "Then we'll answer it, with fire." Down in King's Landing, chaos had grown teeth. Tyrion Lannister, now acting hand, tried to hold the city together with words and coin. But the people hungered, the lords plotted, and Joffrey made things worse with every word he spat. One morning a whisper reached Tyrion's ear. From Varys, from the streets, even from a Lannister cousin. There is talk that Ned Stark planned his death. Tyrion laughed it off at first, but something about it wouldn't leave him. He wasn't a planner, he muttered to himself. He was too damned honest. But then he remembered the look Ned had given him once. Quiet, calculating. And for the first time, Tyrion considered that maybe honesty was the disguise. In the Vale, Peter Baelish sat beside Lysa Arryn, whispering poison into her ear. He watched, the realm from above, thinking himself a master of puppets. But even he couldn't ignore the tremors from the north. The wolves were not only rallying, they were evolving. "Robb Stark has won 3 battles," a raven reported. Baelish frowned. "He's winning hearts. That's more dangerous." He had underestimated Eddard Stark. Everyone had. But Ned had never played the game for himself. He had played it for legacy. And that kind of move, Peter now understood, had a much longer tail. Far across the sea, in Korth, Daenerys stood before a map of Westeros drawn in ash and ink. She listened to tales of the North, of a young king, of rebellion, of a dead man whose name still inspired fear. "Eddard Stark," she said aloud, tasting the name, "the man who died for his family." "More than that," Ser Jorah replied. "Some say he died for a kingdom." She narrowed her eyes. "Then perhaps he and I are not so different." In the flames, the Red Woman whispered prayers to a fire god, but even she, in her shadowy chamber in Dragonstone, saw a face in her. Visions, not Stannis, not Joffrey. A wolf, white-eyed and silent, standing in a field of bones. The Game of Thrones had never accounted for the dead. But Ned Stark's ghost now haunted the board, moving pieces no one saw, not through words, not through armies, but through the hearts he left behind, through the fire he lit in each of his children, through the truth he buried for the right time. Because the lie he told with his last breath was meant to awaken the truth in everyone else, and that truth was coming. The winds howled louder across the north. Snow fell earlier than expected, thick and heavy, as if the land itself was. Morning still, but under that snow something stronger than grief grew. Resolve. The people whispered Ned Stark's name, not with sorrow now, but with fury. With pride. And the more they spoke it, the more the realm remembered what it had lost. Not just a lord, not just a father, a symbol. At Castle Black, Jon Snow stood before the ancient gate, torn between duty and blood. He read Robb's letters, full of victories and vengeance, and he read them as both a brother and a Night's Watchman. But more than the letters, it was the message from Howland Reed that changed everything. The Crannogman's raven had flown far, braving storm and shadow, and in its claws was a piece of parchment. One sentence stood alone. "You must know who you are." Jon stared at the words long into the night. He had always believed he was the mistake, the stain on Ned Stark's honor, the bastard reminder of something shameful. But what if that was the greatest lie of all? What if his father's last confession, the one that saved Sansa, that sparked war, that inspired rebellion, was only half the truth? What if the other half was Jon himself? In Riverrun, Catelyn sat beside a candlelit table, staring at a sealed envelope that Robb had yet to read. Howland's message had come to her, too. Inside, it was a confession of another kind, Ned's final truth, the one truth that had the power to burn the game to the ground. But she couldn't bring herself to open it, because deep down, she knew. Jon Snow wasn't her husband's sin. He was his secret, and the world wasn't ready for that yet. Robb knelt before a map. Every day he watched kingdoms crumble, alliances shift, and his men grow wearier. He didn't know how long they could keep winning, but he knew why they fought. His father's death had not weakened them. It had turned them into wolves with bared fangs. Then came the crow from Howland Reed. Robb read the message, his breath freezing in the winter air. When he looked up, his voice was colder than steel. He knew this would happen. He planned for it all, even Jon. Grey wind growled beside him. It's time to finish what he started. In King's Landing, the crown trembled. Joffrey's tantrums grew crueler. The lords grew more distant. And behind closed doors, Varys moved like a shadow wrapping around. The realm. He had seen plans within plans, but Ned Stark's death had birthed something else entirely. Belief. The kind of belief that couldn't be bribed or broken. That was the most dangerous thing in Westeros. The Spider whispered to Tyrion one night, "A man who dies for honor is a fool, but a man who dies for legacy changes kings." Tyrion finished staring into his wine, and in Braavos, Arya stood at the edge of a canal, whispering her list to herself one last time. But now she added one more name, not to kill but to honor: Eddard Stark. She didn't whisper it with sorrow. She whispered it with purpose. The North had risen. The South had fractured. The East was awakening. And far to the north, under ancient snow and forgotten secrets, something darker stirred. But above all, the memory of one man loomed larger than any throne: Ned Stark, the man who died a traitor, the man who gave up everything so his children could tear the game apart. His head may have rolled, but his legacy stood tall as the blade that cut through silence, as the spark that started a war, and as the father who chose death not as an end, but as the beginning of something unstoppable.